Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this video, I have an important surprise for you. I was in Turkey recently and I met a very important scholar, someone that is very important for us all to know about. And he's also important because he wrote about someone that's very important historically. So in this video, you're going to find out more about him. I've just come back from Istanbul and I had a very fruitful experience there. The reason I went there, and I'll tell you about that first, was I was invited to present at the third Hanafism conference. This is an important conference that takes place every year. This year it took place in Istanbul and I was asked to present about some research that I'm doing. Now most of you will already be aware that early this year or around Ramadan time, an important collection of essays and research papers came out on Hanafism. One of them was something that I wrote on the concept of Darul Islam and Darul Harb. You can buy that and I'll send you the link for that. Just so you know, I don't make any money on any of this. It's all done for the sake of spreading goodness, spreading knowledge, and raising the level of scholarship in our communities and answering some of the big questions that are facing Muslims as we progress and we prosper in the West. Anyway, this paper that I want to present was on the topic of Hisbah. Hisbah is important historically because Hisbah was a way of how Muslims and rulers maintain civil order, to make sure that people were following God's guidance, Allah's guidance, but also maintaining people's rights, and that people, when they fell out of good behavior, something had to happen. So it wasn't that they were taken to a judge, it wasn't that they were punished through the hudud punishments, the corporeal or penal punishments, but rather the muhtasib, the person who was doing hisbah, he would go around the cities and he would visit the villages and he would make sure that, for example, people weren't cheating or defrauding somebody. So when they were selling items, they were making sure that what people were buying was what they wanted to buy, or they were making sure that men and women weren't meeting who weren't meant to meet privately, for example. And there were a host of other things as well. Another one is to make sure coins were properly made and people weren't using fake type of coins. So not very different to modern society. Hisbah became very popular recently because of what happened with ISIS and Daesh, and they were using this mechanism. But I was more interested in how this was taking place in India, or what we call Hindustan, and how the muhtasib would engage there. It's based on an important book called the Nisabul Ihtisab. The Nisabul Ihtisab, so my research was reflecting on that paper, and that is what I was presenting at the third Hanafism conference there in Istanbul. But what's important, what I want to share with you is I met someone very important. Now there's a very important book called The Mabsut of Imam Sarakshi. Now Imam Sarakshi is important, but I also met someone in Istanbul who's translated all the volumes of this book. There are about 15 to 20 volumes on this book, depending on the edition that you have. And I met a Sheikh, a very elderly man by the name of Mustafa Jawad Akshed. May Allah be pleased with him. In Turkish, by the way, when they call their scholars with reverence and respect, they would say Hojam or Effendi. Just like we would say in the South Asian tradition, Maulana or Sheikh or Hazrat, they would use these words. So I met Sheikh Mustafa Jawad, very old man. He's translated the entire Mabsut of Imam Sarakshi from Arabic into Turkish. It's not been translated into English. Maybe one of you one of day can do that important task. But let me talk about Imam Sarakshi first and foremost, because most of us won't know who he is. Now, Imam Shamsul A'imma, he's called. Sarakshi was born around 400 or around 1020 of the Common Era. He was born to a merchant family, so a family of business people, probably in a place called Saraks. This is a city between Mashhad and Mar. Currently, we say this is in Turkmenistan, near the border with Iran. Imam Sarakshi studied in Bukhara, and he studied under very famous scholars. For example, he studied under Shamsul A'imma Abdul Aziz Al-Halwani, who's very famous. And this is why he is called Shamsul A'imma As-Sarakshi, because he got the title from his teachers. So sometimes students, they are so prodigious so productive, so scholarly, that they take titles on from their teachers. He also studied under Sheikh al-Islam Ali bin Hussein bin Muhammad al-Suqti, and other Imams as well. After he completed his studies, he went to a place called Uzjan, which is near Farghana in Transaxonia, what we call Ma Wara al-Nahar or Transox. And this area was controlled by the dynasty which is called the Qara Khanids. Imam Sarakshi's students are no less significant. They include someone called Abu Bakr Muhammad bin Ibrahim al-Hasiri, someone also by the name of Abu Hafs Umar bin Habib, who is actually the maternal grandfather of Imam Marghinani, the author of the famous Al-Hidayah, which is taught in every madrasa in the world. He also was the teacher of Abu Amr Uthman bin Ali bin Muhammad Baykandi, also Burhanul Aimma Abdul Aziz Umar bin Maza, very very important, and Mahmud bin Abdul Aziz Uzjandi, and Ruknuddin Mas'ud bin Hassan. So these were some of his teachers and his students, of course, as well, and he was very very famous as well. Now Imam Sarakshi is a very very important scholar in the Hanafi madhab, or at least in the Hanafi tradition. Now to keep it brief, Imam Sarakshi settled in Uzjand, and the Khan of the time, Shamsul Mulk, had him arrested, and this is very very important. He was detained in jail for 14 years, we're told, from around 466 Hijri, which is 1074 of the Common Era, for around 15 or 13 years. Some say from 466 to around 480. So he was imprisoned. He was actually thrown into a well. He was imprisoned in a well. Now there's lots of reasons as to why this happened. One view, which is held by many scholars, and this is obviously debated, is that he was jailed because of his blunt criticism of the Khan, who allowed his officers to marry his what's called the Ummul Walads before their waiting periods had expired. So this is like a technical issue, but he was very very principled, and this is what you find with real ulama. They stick by their principles. Some say another reason was that the Qara Khanids imposed heavy taxes upon their people, and Imam Sarakshi encouraged the people to not pay these taxes. This is one claim that's also been held. Another one is that there was a theological dispute between Imam Sarakshi and the ruler over certain theological issues, which led to him being imprisoned. So we have a number of views as to why Imam Sarakshi was put in prison. But some say he was held in a castle, but most people say that he was held in imprisonment in a well for 14 years. So he was held in captivity for 14 years. After 3 years of freedom in Marghinani, Imam Sarakshi died in 483 Hijri, which is around 1090 in the Common Era. Now he's written many books. He's a scholar of great reputation. The most famous one is this one here, the Mabsut. But he has a book called Usul, which is very very important and worth reading and studying. He also has a book by the name of Sharh Silsil Kabir, which is very very important. A book called Nukat, Sharh Ziyadat, and he also has a Sharh of Mukhtasar al-Tahawi as well. And he has another book by the name of Ashratus Sa' as well. His books are very systematic, and he builds upon the tradition. So this is what we do as scholars and students, is that we build upon the people that have come before us. Now, according to his biographers, it's mentioned that he dictated this book. So this entire book and all the 15 volumes, which is around this much, was dictated to his students. This includes this book, this includes his book on the Usul, and also one of the other books, which is the Sharh Siyahul Kabir. He literally dictated this from memory. I mean, when you read this book, it's so deep, it's so reflective, it's so intricate, that you come to the conclusion this is someone who was a genius and who was also blessed by God to have such deep knowledge, to speak from a well, and for students to sit at the top of the well and to listen to him and make notes as he is teaching as well. So I want to talk a little bit about his main book here, which is the Mabsut, which is probably his most important and famous work. It's a very comprehensive text on the Hanafi madhab, and it's based on another book, or it's based on another series of scholars. So as you know, in the Hanafi madhab, Imam Abu Hanifa had a student by the name of Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani. He died around 189 Hijri, 805 Common Era. And so it's based on his works. It's based on the student of Imam Abu Hanifa. Now there's another scholar that's important. His name is Hakim al-Shahid al-Marwazi. He died around 334, 946 Common Era. And what he did was he abridged the work of Imam Shaybani, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, in order to make it easier for students to study. And hence the work was called the Mukhtasar, because he summarized Imam Muhammad's books to make it simple for people. He did an ikhtisar of it. Around 150 years later, Imam Sarakshi emerges and he senses that students weren't studying fiqh, and so he was determined to produce his own formulation, his own book, to try and encourage and revive the study of fiqh as well. And so he wrote the Mabsut in order to justify and elaborate upon the Hanafi code or Hanafi law, and he used Marwazi's Mukhtasar to do this as well. Elsewhere he mentions 3 reasons why students were not learning fiqh, and this is an important critique sometimes that we also find in madrasas of today. People don't study fiqh at a deeper level, or they don't understand fiqh at a level that should be done. Fiqh is tafaqquh, to have a deep understanding of God's law. So he mentions, Imam Sarakshi, 3 reasons as to why people did not engage in fiqh. One of them was a lack of enthusiasm. You can imagine if your students aren't motivated, that usually comes because the teachers are not driven or motivated. If you have good teachers, they inspire their students. The second reason was what he says was a sterile pedagogy of teaching texts that were irrelevant, engage in lengthy arguments, what's called al-nikat ardiyya, that weren't really significant. And the third reason he mentioned is that scholars made study too complex. It was too much philosophical terms into legal definitions. So Imam Sarakshi set about really making it accessible. This is a wonderful book. I have a student who is from Turkey in the UK, and that person is doing a PhD on this very book, and I want you to pray that that's a successful PhD with the permission of God. Now in here there's an important book called Kitabul Kasb. It's been produced separately, and I will provide the link for you in Arabic, and it's called a Kitabul Kasb. And you'd think that this book is about finance or business transactions, but when you read this book, it's very clear that it's a book on zuhud, which is this idea of not engaging with the world too much, this idea of asceticism, rather than with standard legal issues. So Imam Sarakshi also mentions, and his method in the Mabsut is to interpret the law in a way that goes to the asal, i.e. what is the real discussion point here? What is the principal cause? What is the ma'ani? My friend Dr. Suhail, Sheikh Suhail Hanif, has a wonderful PhD which he completed a few years ago on the Hidayah of Imam Marghinani. I encourage everyone to read it. It's wonderful, and you should learn from him and you should benefit from him. In any case, what Imam Sarakshi is doing is he's doing what Sheikh Suhail is showing in his PhD through the book of Imam Marghinani. And he wants to show, Imam Sarakshi, that the law makes sense, there's coherence to it, and in every fiqh masala, in every question, there's an asal. It all goes back, it makes sense, and you have to understand. And this is why I say to my students that when you're studying chapters of fiqh, whether it's to do with purification, whether it's to do with jihad, whether it's to do with fasting, you should be able to make it coherent. You should be able to know what is the actual legal meaning, what's actually going on in here as well. So I just wanted to share that about Imam Sarakshi. Now time is running out, so I want to talk about my trip to Istanbul. I met the translator into Turkish, Sheikh Mustafa. He's also a brilliant person. When I went to see him through a friend of mine, I went to his room, and immediately the first thing that captured me was that his entire desk was covered with books and manuscripts, and he had a magnifying glass. He's a very old man, and he was just reading. I mean, that's all he was doing. And this is what makes scholars, that they spend their entire time just reading, writing, researching. One of the sad things that I find today is that people do read, but they don't write, they don't produce. Scholars in the past would produce scholarship. There are a number of reasons for that, one of which is that scholars nowadays aren't funded or taken care of as they used to be, so they have to earn livelihoods in other ways, which means they're too tired to write books. This is why we have to think about ways to support ulama, scholars, so they can free up some time and write books, and that would become a form of reward for us. If anyone's interested in sponsoring scholarship, please do get in touch. So I met Sheikh Mustafa Jawad. He has a very interesting history. He lived in Turkey, spent most of his life in Turkey. He spent some time in America. He learned English. He told me that when he was writing the translation, and this was through a translator who was explaining to me what the Sheikh was saying, was he slept very little, and he spent around 13 years to write this book. He spent 13 years just translating it into Turkish, and the reason he did this was Turkey is a Hanafi country. They broadly follow the Hanafi school of law, but historically in the last 100 years, unfortunately, things have happened and people have become a little bit disconnected to the Hanafi school of law. So he wanted to make sure there's some sort of continuity. People appreciate the depth of the Hanafi madhab. This is something that I'm very much a proponent of, even in the UK here, that we need to make sure that we understand and we continue to practice and engage with the Hanafi madhab. Now, when he was a child, or when he was younger rather, he completed a PhD in commercial law, but he also has background in Islamic law. And he was telling me that when he was a student, because of the secular hegemony, the secular structures, it was very difficult, as you know, for Muslims to practice their faith. Not like when you go to Istanbul today, where you can hear the adhan and people are allowed to practice their faith, sisters wear their scarves. That wasn't allowed when he was a student, and people hid their Islam. Many many professors were quite secular. He talks about his own teachers, his own professors who hid their religion or weren't quite practicing. But he quietly got on with his work, and this is really, really important, that he carried on studying and writing. And even himself, he says that he was exiled for around 14 to 15 years himself. So he has a similarity with Imam Sarakshi. Imam Sarakshi was exiled, or he was in prison, and Sheikh Mustafa was exiled because of his faith. So I want to share this about him. I also want to say that he's a deeply pious person, very, very committed to scholarship, and I found it very, very moving. I have an extreme fascination with the Hanafi madhab, but also with Imam Sarakshi, because I found a lot of insights in there that I haven't found elsewhere as well. And he has a way of summarizing what's come before him in a way that's very neat and tidy, and he basically brings hadith, Quran, reason together really, really well. Maybe at some point, if I have enough students, I'd love to teach it. I mean, I'm studying it with some students privately. But so a wonderful book, and a wonderful scholar. I was very moved. I want to add one more thing. Sheikh Mustafa also was very proud when he told me that Imam Sarakshi's grave was lost for a while because of communism and what happened in the Muslim lands around there. And so he went there. The place was called Kyrgyzstan, and he spent 5 days looking for the grave of Imam Sarakshi. He eventually found it by asking the locals, and he told the people that this is your Sheikh. So the people were so disconnected because of communism that they didn't even know that they had great scholars literally in their backyard, buried in their backyard. So he tried to remind them and revive religious learning in them. The Turkish government has sponsored projects there. They've made it into a place where people can visit. Maybe one day we can all go together to visit the resting place of Imam Sarakshi as well. And so this is someone who really loves scholarship. Sheikh Mustafa is someone that is deeply aligned to teaching and scholarship, something that I'm aligned with as well. And so it was nice to meet someone who's much more older than me, much more wiser than me, much more experienced than me. And I hope that I can, and we can all continue that legacy. So Imam Sarakshi was a way for me to connect to somebody in Istanbul, and hopefully we can bring that tradition here into our own homes, into our own communities. If you found this very, very useful, please do share it with other people. Please do share this content. Make some comments if you need to. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm trying to provide content that's wholesome and meaningful. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.